Hello and welcome to the Dr. DigiPol show. I am Alan Rosenblatt, aka Dr. DigiPol, and we are excited today for a very interesting show on art in the resistance. We are going to be talking about the role of art and artists in the resistance movement. I have a whole slate of guests that we'll introduce in a moment, but I wanted to queue up while I add put. While I get everybody up onto the screen here, I want to get some background here. In 1966, documentary director Frederick Wiseman was granted unprecedented access to Bridgewater State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where he was doing a bunch of filming of inmates, some really heinous people, from my understanding, and while he was doing, once he was done doing this, he put together this documentary, and there were some objections to it. There was objections to it because the inmates didn't actually grant permission. It was their family and the institution that granted their permission, and so the documentary was relegated to only being allowed to be shown for educational purposes. Years later, the movie was called The Tittycut Follies. Now, this movie, despite it being relegated to educational purposes only, actually had some serious implications in changing the way people were talking about issues related to the way we were taking care of and institutionalizing the criminally insane. There were video clips, film clips in the movie of the staff hurting the inmates naked, hosing them. It was just really not a very flattering situation. Years later, and in fact, just recently, Wiseman was asked to turn this documentary into a ballet. For a moment, but apparently he had done some documentaries about ballets as well, and so it was a topic he was very interested in. His own experience dealing with institutionalization, and had come out, and so really understood the situation, and they're making the ballet now. By an interviewer on NPR last week, what his role was in using the ballet and the movie to change and be an activist on behalf of how we of policy regarding how we take care of the criminally insane and people in institutions generally. Wiseman said, "The impetus for the ballet is not to affect social change, but to make as good a ballet as one can with the material, as I tried to make as good a movie as I can with the material. Then the use or the consequences of the work is out of your hands." In other words, he's taking a very hands-off approach to the notion of the role of the artist with regard.
Uh-oh.
I think we may have lost Alan.
Yeah.
Hey, Max, is this something you can look at? Well, I think the question he was asking was dealt with art as provocation, and sort of looking at, what sort of responsibilities an artist has in terms of what they put out there. Joe, I know you're a writer. Maybe you'd like to speak to that?
Yeah, so I'm interested in what Alan was quoting about the idea of making the best art you can and then putting it out into the world, and then you're not responsible for the consequences, which is true to some extent. Like, once you put something out there, you can't control the consequences. It's going to be interpreted in ways. But I think as writers or artists, we have a responsibility to try to channel those consequences and try to put forth something that is as responsible as we can make it, and recognize, what potential side effects it could have. And this comes up.
Oh boy, and then there were two.
You still with us, Joanne?
I'm back.
Okay.
Maybe we'll get Alan back too. I don't know where I got cut off, but this comes up a lot in genre fiction right now. Especially, I write science fiction and fantasy, and there's a lot of talk about, portraying a diverse set of characters and doing so responsibly, and knowing that if you do the best you can, but if you don't do well enough, you may cause unintentional harm to that community that you're trying to portray, no matter what your intentions are. So I think there's a lot of responsibility on artists and writers as we're engaging in social change work and those kinds of issues to try to get it as right as we can. Alan, have we got you back now?
Hello, Joe, can you hear me now?
Hey, welcome back.
Thank you. Were you able to hear anything that I said at the beginning of the show?
We heard some of it. I think you were just talking about the idea of putting out the best art that you can into the world.
And did you hear the whole story about Titicut Follies, I hope?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. Welcome to the show. It looks like we're having troubles getting multiple people up on stage at the same time, so I'll cycle through people just to avoid the freezing again. But welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about Future Shift.
Yeah, so I'm Joe Miles. I'm the co-founder of Future Shift, and we're a project that looks specifically at science fiction and speculative fiction, that being a larger umbrella that encompasses science fiction, fantasy, horror, and how these stories can be used as a lens and a tool for our social change work. So we work with organizations, writers, and activists to think about how science fiction themes can apply to our work and how we can use these stories to do everything from engage activists and create narratives that people can really grasp onto about how they can engage in activism themselves, to imagining what potential futures could look like if we choose, this direction into a totalitarian society, or we choose this other direction, into a society based more on progressive values, or if technology forces us in one direction or another. Science fiction gives us a great set of tools to envision what those possible futures can look like that are so integral to our social change work, because as activists, we're always trying to envision the future and bring about particular futures. So I think science fiction can be a really useful tool for helping us to latch onto what that could actually look like that we're trying to bring about.
So part of when I first started talking to you about what you're doing and hearing what you're saying, one of the things that jumped out at me is just remembering, and I just saw this recently on the reruns, the original Star Trek, which featured the first interracial kiss on television. That was clearly a harbinger of things to come, and now that is commonplace and not a big deal. But clearly, science fiction was involved in breaking grounds. Are there some, what are some other examples where you've seen science fiction really kind of pave the way towards change in society?
Towards change, I think the Star Trek's a really good example. I could talk all day about Star Trek and how it's helped, I think, more than anything else I can think of, to envision what a positive future for humanity could look like. We have so many dark futures represented right now. And I'm thinking specifically about The Handmaid's Tale, which was just released as a Hulu series a couple of weeks ago. And that's such a dark future. And I think it's terrifying because it's such a plausible future. We've seen this week that the new healthcare bill could classify, sexual assault survivors as having a pre-existing condition. These are really scary concepts that we see in science fiction, and we start to see them mirrored in real life. I think we could use more science fiction that gives us these positive visions, like Star Trek has, trying to think of other examples. There's a lot of older examples, like Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed is pretty famous for giving us a view of what could a functioning communist society actually look like. And there's some other examples, but I think we've really been predominated by dark dystopian visions, especially in recent years.
So this is an interesting question that you it raises an interesting question in the sense that Star Trek was a much more positive view of the future. We've seen in recent years much more dystopian view of the future. In fact, you could argue pretty much since 1984 with Neuromancer, we've seen a lot of really dark dystopian future images, and maybe even earlier than that. But what is it that is there something about what's happening in society at a given moment in time that shapes the science fiction of that period to make it either optimistic or dystopian?
That's a really good question. I don't know exactly. I have a sort of a personal theory that we write or we create fiction in response to what's happening around us. So we might...
Hold on one second. Sorry. I'm having... Go ahead.
I think what we're experiencing around us shapes the kind of fiction and art that we're creating. So I see a lot of responses right now to the political situation that we're in that really shine a light on the challenges that we're having, and also are starting to, create a sense of, we're seeing more fiction, I think, about resistance and rebellion and what happens when we come into conflict with authoritarian governments, which I think is a response to the situation that we're in. I think that we've maybe in part had darker fiction recently as there's less faith in government, less faith in corporations. We've living in a pretty cynical time, and I think that our fiction reflects that. But it can also help, on the flip side, let us think about more positive outcomes and help us envision those. And if we don't have touchstones like that, I think it's challenging to imagine how we can get out of the situation that we're in. We look to stories so much to help us guide our path forward.
So I'm going to try to bring Prolyphic up while we're talking. So just bear with me if this becomes an issue. But tell me, Joe, tell me a little bit about how you are how you're leveraging this insight about science fiction for, what are you trying to do with regard to the resistance and how does Future Shift fit into this whole space?
Yeah, so there are a few angles that we're trying to attack that from. So we're working with organizations. We do workshops and consulting with organizations to think about how they're approaching their work and what sort of stories are they telling. As nonprofits, we tend to be very good at telling, real world stories about our people that we're working with and the issues that we're working on, but telling those more imaginative, future focused stories about what are we actually trying to build together. So that's one thing that we do. And then something that we're starting to do more is talk to activists and look at, what lessons, what inspiration can we take from the stories that we love? What can we learn from, Frodo and Sam and Lord of the Rings? What can we learn from Star Wars and the Rebel Alliance? Like, how can that help us? How can this, as we're struggling, it's really hard being an activist and staying motivated in the face of what seems like constant struggle and challenge. And we see that in stories and we see people overcoming those barriers. And I think that's really important.
So they, in a sense, these stories provide role models for people to stay the course, keep focused, and see a light on the other side of the tunnel.
Yeah, I think they really can. And I'd like to be able to raise up those examples and help people focus on them.
Great. Prolyphic, are you able to hear us? And
I can hear you guys. Yep.
Welcome to the show. So tell us a little bit about what you do. You're a rapper, and
I'm
that fit
a MC.
into this?
Yep, I'm a MC producer out of Providence, Rhode Island. I'm on an independent label, also out of Providence, Rhode Island, called Strange Famous Records. That was started by MC Sage Francis.
Okay, and what your music is politically charged, issue focused. What's the focus?
I think the focus is just it's the outer world coming into me and then coming back out. I wouldn't call myself an activist. I wouldn't call myself a political rapper. It's me as an individual observing the world and my interpretation of it. I don't like genreify myself. I just kind of put music out there and let people digest it, basically.
So you're taking the viewpoint that Frederick Wiseman did when in my opening story about the Titicut Follies. He does the best to put that material out, and it lives on its own and inspires people.
Yes. So this is an issue I always struggle with, and it was like the Charles Barkley phrase back in the day, like I'm not your role model.
Right.
Like, I'm not a role model for kids, right? But in this day and age with social media, it's like gun control. Like companies that produce guns, like I get it. Like you have a business, you're producing, but you might not have like a response. Like it might not hold up in court that you go to jail when there's like mass killings happening, but you damn well have a responsibility, like within the community and within individuals that you live amongst. Because like if you're not pulling the trigger, but if you see what's happening and you kind of turn a blind eye to it, that's how the community can judge you. And I'm an advocate for free speech. I'm an advocate for art being what it is and not having and not persecuting artists for what they put out. But I don't know. I think I don't know. Like you're going to be an asshole in my eyes if you do something, you know what I mean? If you put out stuff like that. So I don't agree with.
Let me ask you, you say you produce music that reflects the world that comes into you. Mm-hmm. Are you an activist or are you involved in political or social action separately from your music?
Yeah, so I actually
did you
don't
turn out to protest in any of these?
Yeah, no. So So basically, I went to college for video production, and that's the field that I make my living off of now. Is that I work in video production, and rap has become something that I do because I love to do it. I am involved in. I went to the Women's March. I went to the Healthcare March. I'm calling my local senators and my local representatives like about the Healthcare Act, about immigration. I'm offering video services to nonprofits for free because I feel like this is a moment where my ideology and what I think and what I believe is that a breaking point where where this country's heading right now is anti of everything I want it to be when it comes to the environment, when it comes to education, and when it comes to healthcare. So me as an individual, then it's necessary for me to be out there and using like my friends in the music community, my skills in video production and in music production to help get information out there. If I'm not, somebody else is. So, you know, there's such a focus on an individual in this country that the communities, we don't act as a community, you know, and I want to change that. So that's why.
Right. So you're using your skills to create images and messages that are related to the world around you, the political issues, and you're making music. But your music is not explicitly connected to it, but sort of empathically connected to it.
I think, like, you know, who I am, like I'm a terrible liar. So the music and the productions that I put out, whether it be video or music, it's what I think and what I believe. And what I think and what I believe is forever, you know, I'm forever changing and evolving as a person. Like who I was like 3 years ago is not who I am today, right? Because I'm a father now, and like I'm a husband, and you know, when I was like single I had different concerns. So I'm forever changing, but like there are ground foundations that my parents put in me that I believe in. And I think like education, healthcare, like I don't think those should be luxuries. You know what I mean? That should be the basis. Like that should be a right. So like things like that, I think that it shouldn't be an argument. Like those are the things that I'm fighting for, because like what I think about like other music or other movies, I mean, it's my personal opinion. But I think when it comes to things that affect people at large, like I want to put a message out there that gives people the whole, gives them the whole package, and they can interpret however they want. But I'm going to put it out there the way I see it, and you know, and they can.
So I understand that you've written songs that are about the environment, consumerism, gun control. What kinds of messages? I mean, how explicit are your messages versus sort of suggestive? You know, are you saying describing the situation or prescribing solutions?
Yeah, so that's why I don't call myself an activist. It's because that a lot of times that sometimes I don't know, but it's like it's something that I'm dealing with and I'm struggling with, and I'm just kind of frustrated, so I'm going to put it out there. So I did a song recently. I'll do two songs. Like one song I did called "Go Green." It was about the whole Go Green campaign that happened. I don't know, in like 2010, like when NBC had like their logo green, and everybody was pushing like for this Go Green, and it became this. Basically, what I found out about General Electric is that like this river they polluted in New York, the Housatonic. They offered their services at a cost to clean it up. So it's just like, okay, cool. Like you're just gonna pollute this river, and then you're gonna pay to get it. So that's what that song is just kind of about, the hypocrisy of this whole Go Green thing. Where, and myself included, like I can't live without the appliances. Like I can't live without my smartphone, like my cameras. Like that's how I make my living, is using technology and using these technological innovations that we've created. But and you know, on another point, like we are killing our environment. Like my water smells like chlorine. Like the Great Barrier Reef is dying. So like, I know I point the finger at myself in that song, but then I also put it out there. Like, you know, what are we thinking? You know,
right.
Like we live in a world that like the environment affects everybody, not just me, not just like rich folks, not just poor folks. It affects everybody. So I wanted to put that out there, and I wanted to do it in a way that wasn't like a sappy. It's a hard song. Like it has like the beat is pound. You know, it's a hardcore song. So I wanted to put it out there for like rap folks to be like to hear something that isn't so cliche soft, that had a political environmental message about it. And then the other one I want to speak on is a song I wrote about gun violence, and it's really just about, it's three scenarios where it's me as an observer from the media. It's really about the media's portrayal of gun violence. And, the first verse is about, what happens after a mass killing, like how the media like shows like this troubled teen or troubled soldier. And it's like, so that's what I'm not even doing, but that's what that one's about. The second verse is from the perspective of me viewing the actual person doing the killing. And the third verse is about not mass killings, but the violence that happens in the inner city and how that's been neglected for decades. And it's still being neglected unless it's being shown in like a horrific way of kind of like looking in at a zoo instead of like treating people like human beings. So it's not like me being like, we need to stop gun violence. It's more of like, think about how we approach it and how the media portrays it. And I'm not like saying we should do this. It's more of like, we're the problem. Like, forget the guns. Like, why are we buying guns? Why are we killing? You know what I mean? Like, why do we feel the need to have a gun? Like, well, we're gonna start a revolution. Like, you know what I mean? We're gonna grab the musket, man. Like, so it's more of like this psychology of the media and this gun violence thing. So it's not like a rally cry to shut down the NRA. It's more of like, I wish the NRA would just go out of business. Kind of
right.
thing. So,
it sounds, in some ways, I heard a photographer, a friend of mine is a photographer who made her name going into the West Bank and taking pictures of things that most people weren't taking pictures of, basically shining a light on the dark corners of the problems of the world. And it sounds like in some ways that's what you're doing, bringing things to the fore.
That's exactly how I feel it. Yeah. A lot of the video, like I just helped produce a video for the Head Start program. Like I got a chance to shoot it, and it's going to be shown to members of Congress. Right. So, and I think that's like the literal sense of what I'm doing. And I think you hit it on the head. Like if I had to define myself as an artist, it's like, yeah, I'm out there with it, like with the camera from my perspective, and I'm choosing what I'm taking a photo of, but I'm putting it out there for a reason, because I either think it's interesting or I think it's being neglected.
Got it. Well, that's really, really, I mean, that's an interesting approach. And it's kind of like what Wiseman was saying about his ballet and his movie. I make the best presentation I can, and other people take it from there, which is a very strong contrast to Michael Moore, for example, who takes his stuff and then really hits the ground to be an activist. I want to bring into the conversation, Chris Burley is here. Chris, welcome. You're joining us from the great state of Colorado, Denver in particular, and you've worked with a lot of artists and musicians, or at least some in this context. But your background is as an activist and as an organizer and as a messenger or communication strategist. Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing in this space.
Yeah. I think I maybe kind of want to reflect a little bit on some of the things that Al said, because I think there's an important thread there, and I think there's some basic concepts looking at here. One is sort of self-reflection, right? So a very important part of any social movement is folks internalizing the questions that it raises, right? So taking a hard look in a mirror. So getting back to what Prolyphic does, what some other artists are doing right now, that idea of the sort of like observing the world, then reporting back. The founder of that label, his first, I think he used to call himself a personal journalist. And that's an ethic that I see a lot in the hip hop scene. As it kind of takes the mantle of that folk music once held, in terms of telling the stories of the people and demanding that we as an audience interact with that on an emotional level. So I think that's a good framework to get to think about how artists interact with advocacy organizations interact with decision makers, and understanding the role that each can play in those. So while Prolyphic may not feel comfortable talking about insurance liability for gun deaths as a public policy matter, he can certainly provide context for people as to why that might be an important conversation to have. And I think the challenge, and I think the singular moment that we have right now, is you have an alignment of, artists who really are elevating, these issues in their own lives and in their own personal journals and the stories that they tell. Those are aligning with a lot in the advocacy community. And the real trick is to figure out, who the best dance partners are. So, for instance, a couple of years back, I was working with an organization, fantastic organization called Women Thrive Alliance, who works on empowering women and girls around the world. One of the things that we sort of identified as a sort of structural, systemic barrier that we had was implicit misogyny. And one place where that is pretty prevalent is in hip hop. So what we did was, we knew that Prolyphic, we knew that some of his label mates were pretty outspoken on this and other issues, and really looked at this idea of people as people and the basic dignity and rights of all people, and formed a sort of public awareness campaign where around that, where they participated in sort of speaking out against violence against women. Through that, I think we were able to reach a different kind of audience, and an audience that hadn't asked those questions that Prolyphic was asking and that some of his label mates were asking. So I think that's kind of a table setter. I don't know that necessarily answers your question, Alan, but I wanted to provide a little bit of a framework for how I see this issue. And before we kind of talk about like what are some specific ways that creative folks can engage with organizations and vice versa. I'm not sure if Alan's still with us here. I think while we wait for Alan to get back on, here's.
Alan, you there? Well, I wanted to chime in on this idea of how the approach that writers can take or artists can take to engaging in activism. And I think it's obviously different for everyone. And I see some writers in the science fiction community who are very personally involved in activism, some who are deliberately using their art to incorporate those themes, some that are doing it more passively. Hey, Alan, you're back?
Yep, I'm here. You've been on. I just refreshed my screen.
Cool. Yeah, so I think that there is room. There's something that I think Prolyphic said early on, that you don't want to be like preachy when you're incorporating themes about social change or gun violence or the environment or what have you into your work, but there is room to do it deliberately. And one thing that at Future Shift we like to do is talk to writers about ways to incorporate those themes. And I would love to see more collaboration between writers and the nonprofit community. There's so much expertise and such a wealth of perspective that nonprofits bring that I think is really undertapped by the arts community as a whole. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to work together there in the same way that science fiction writers might collaborate with scientists to make sure that they're getting the science right. I think they can also work with nonprofits and people who are experts in these issues to make sure that they're getting the issues right.
So in a way, you're playing sort of both ends there. You're taking advantage of content that's being put out by writers as a way to create messaging out to the world on how to deal with issues, but you're also working with the writers to really hone their craft so that they provide you with that material to be able to use it.
Yeah, that's what we want to do. I think some writers are deliberately incorporating those issues and trying to convey a message. Some are doing it, just in the course of creating good art. But I think there is value in being deliberate about it. And, in the course of creating any art, you're going to do your research. You're going to understand the issues that you're working with. And I think there's a lot of room for more conversations to happen about, like, how are we portraying these issues in our art? There's a whole subgenre of climate fiction that looks at, what's going to happen to the world post climate change. And there's a lot of, technological solutions to climate change, or ways that we adapt technologically. And there's some really good thinking about how we adapt as a society too. And I'd love to see dialogues, for example, between those writers and nonprofit organizations that are working on climate change, and how can we use this to really move activism and help to avoid these, none of them are good futures. None of them are futures for the most part that we want to embrace. So how do we learn from that?
So how are you connecting with writers, to work with them? What's your model for putting this together?
And so I will say that we're a fairly young organization. We're just starting to work with a lot of these communities, but we do workshops, and we'd love to bring in writers to these workshops or bring them into conversation with organizations. Something we want to do is actually hook up nonprofits and writers to do partnerships together. And then also, we are hoping in the future to offer trainings for writers who want to get better at doing this in their work. How do you tackle these issues in fiction without being preachy or being cheesy? So those are some ways that we want to bring those communities together.
It's that's a great opportunity. Workshops. I'm trying to bring Ben up on screen. I'm going to take you down and see if I can bring him up one at a time. But Ben is Ben Barnett, who is a regular on our show, also happens to be the director of the Philadelphia Independent Film Festival, which just had the event just ended last week. I went up and spoke there, but if I can get him up here, because the film festival is an interesting model for connecting, recruiting directors, recruiting films, recruiting the art into a venue. And I see some parallels here from what Joe is trying to do at Future Shift in terms of bringing connecting with writers and working with them on the front end, and then leveraging their content on the back end for activism. But Ben, welcome again back to the show.
Good to be here.
But you're getting, I mean, the festival model is an interesting one here, because you're bringing in all these applications of submissions to the festival of all these movies, and so you're kind of filtering through and saying, oh, this one's really good, this one's really good. And I know that, number one on your concern is, the artistic quality of the product, but I'm sure the subject matter makes a big difference as well, in that a film that you might see as submitted to the festival might be, the topic might be a deciding factor. Tell us a little bit about how that happens, and the relationship between the films you're seeing, the messages that they're trying to share, and how that plays into your decision to bring them into the festival.
Well, we receive over 450 films, pretty much on average every year, sometimes over 500. It also depends on how aggressive we are. This year we screened 54 films, so that's a little over 10% what we received. And what we have is what we call the Underground Film Forum. We've been meeting off and on, loosely online, in front of each other for almost 20 years now. That's one of the first digital media groups in Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania as well. And really what we do is we watch the films, but we watch the films from the standpoint that there's no information given. We watch the film as a film. We then pass it along to others who might be watching it in a group. So we'll have, for example, what we say is 6 to 20 people watch every single film. And in that process, the first time they watch it, it's pretty much a thumbs up or a thumbs down, which moves it down to the second and third levels of screening, which then, again, will watch the film. So films that we actually bring to the screen, we've watched anywhere between 4 and 6 times. And that means we can have an average of 24 to 80 people actually have eyes on that film before it gets to the screen. So that's the process. As far as picking the content, from a content standpoint, which I think is also what you're asking, we look for genuine storytelling. We look to screen films that are not, for example, propaganda when it comes to documentaries. Look up on this. Okay, and sorry, I was just reading your on-screen combo there. And we then bring
So we're Ben, welcome back. Sorry, we got a little locked up there. So you go through this multiple level of screening to get people to thumbs up, move the films down the line. At some point, you're bringing the festival rolls around. Some of the films that you're showing certainly have an activist message, a public, a policy message or a social commentary. The artists, the actors and the directors and the writers, they come into the festival. What are you seeing in terms of, I know at the end of the movies you're having interviews, they stand up in front of the crowd. Are the conversations getting into the sort of those activist themes and, what motivated them, what are they trying to do? Or does it really focus on the art itself, or a mix?
It's a good question, and let me make a comment before I forget. From the comments I've heard about writers meeting nonprofits, I really think film festivals are a fantastic way to meet writers. First of all, they're filled with writers, and some of the best writers from an independent standpoint, most likely you'll ever find. We have authors come through. We have writers of big films. The irony is, in film festivals, is the writer's usually the last person to get asked to show up. So as opposed to a famous actor or director or something like this. So really the irony is that writers come to film festivals with the intent to look for other work and other like-minded people. So, getting to the question, the filmmakers, those two things. One is our film festival pushes the narrative. So our film festival has a goal to globally for 10 years now seek out new and independent films. So we travel all over the world to figure this out online and as well as showing up. What we do is push the narrative and the dialogue about the story. What the filmmaker usually does is push the process in which they've made it, which in other words could come from the experience that brought the idea to the forefront, as well as the technology or a combination of both. But we, as the moderators of these discussions that we have before and after, we like to say, and we also have a digital soapbox that we put up that people stand up under a light and give out narratives to people in the crowds. We push the narrative of what the film's actually trying to say and what they really mean, whether it's drama, thriller, or documentary, or any kind of film, animation. So we really try and tease out what's really going on there, which sometimes is pretty benign filmmaking. People just have an idea. It's often like a song that doesn't make sense but has a good rhythm or a hook, so people they'll make it and play it. Sometimes this happens with film. We're talking about nature. We'll watch a film on trees growing. We'll watch, construction building. So there's a lot of stuff that comes, but really our job, I think, is to bring out what you just asked. And this really comes true when we start talking about the political and the documentaries and the political features and thrillers that come out, which usually, from an independent filmmaker standpoint, are often many hidden narratives in there that maybe in a bigger film in Hollywood you would.
Right. I've got Prolyphic back on the screen, and I wanted to ask, Ben was talking about, this process of festivals bringing, bringing filmmakers together, but that they're actively seeking filmmakers to bring to the festivals. What's the model for you as somebody producing music? What how are you getting that message out? Are people coming to you? What's your distribution model? What's your collaboration model? How does that work for you?
So we're an independent label. So we have a small distribution that gets us. I mean, CDs are dead basically. So we're not putting that much effort into putting CDs into stores anymore. We're really pushing our own digital distribution. You can download all of our music through our website. So you don't even have to go to iTunes. You don't even have to go to Tidal or any other stuff. But it's all groundwork. It's all through relationships, through social media. I mean, that's how we're getting the word out. And like our fans pushing our music to other folks. And when we promote something on Twitter, on Facebook.
I can't hear him, by the way.
Yeah.
Can you hear me, Alan? No?
I hear you fine. So,
Okay. Yeah, so when we're pushing it through Twitter and Facebook, and we count on their posts, and because we don't have the money get our music played on the radio, or to get some big corporation to put their stamp on it. So I think it's really on the artists and the community. Again, I think it all comes back to community. I think we need to do more collaborating with folks outside of music. Like independent artists and nonprofits need to start working together, because I mean, the radio, like for independent artists, is impossible to get onto, and college radio is pretty much non-existent. So our outlets have now just become social media and performing.
Right.
So I think we need to do more collaborating.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm gonna stop Ben over here, and I want to bring Joe back up because this is an interesting question. Actually, I'm going to bring Chris up for a moment because it sounds to me like there's some interesting nexuses going on here. There's the intersection of the artist with the nonprofit. There's the intersection of the musician with the filmmaker. There's the activist with the film. And there is this need in today's marketplace to be more creative on distribution. As you say, Prolyphic, CDs are dead. If you really think about it, Spotify, what does Spotify do? It means that people no longer seek out music. They pick a topic and then they just passively receive whatever is fed to them in the stream. And so it seems like, what Joe was saying about working with writers to work themes into their work, and then taking those writing products and incorporating them into advocacy messaging. What you were saying, Prolyphic, in terms of shining a light on issues that hit you hard individually, and creating a piece of art that shows that, and then having that get incorporated into a campaign by somebody incorporating it into what they're doing, maybe even having them, the campaigns come to you and say, we're looking for music that conveys this message. Is that something you'd like to write about? These nexuses create new opportunities for reaching new audiences and like-minded audiences. Chris, I suspect very much that this is a lot of the way you've been thinking about this.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Is there are people for whom representation matters, both in terms of issues or in terms of there's a writer named Kelly Sue DeConnick and a lot of other folks. Chi Willow Wilson's another good example, to women who really have done a lot of work to increase the diversity at Marvel Comics. Going so far as to kind of create a new feminist archetype superhero in Captain Marvel that Kelly Sue DeConnick represented there. But like the question here is like, how do you get all of these people together? And I can tell you how this has happened for me in the past. I've worked with artists like Nico Case, some other punk rock bands, and and often this is the question of one of us reaching out. Mayim Bialik, I think, was another person we worked with, and it happened one of three ways. One was the artist was engaged in the issues already and reached out to the organization that I was working with. That was the case with Nico Case, where she actually let the group I was working with table at her shows whenever she came to town. She came in to talk with our policy experts and brought a binder book with her about some wildlife issues she was concerned with. But she's a true believer and spends a lot of time on this stuff. And in her spare time, she does seek out these organizations. That's not typically how it works. Folks spend a lot of time in vans and at truck stops and stuff when they're touring. So the other approach we've used is to actively reach out either via social media or through the talent agencies. Most creatives have some sort of artist representation, whether that's the booking folks for their label or whether it's their PR person, and just spending a little bit of time figuring out who those folks are and writing a very precise request for an engagement from that person is helpful. And then I'm trying to think another model is there are actually agencies that do this. You can pay people to connect you with Hollywood folk. That tends to be something that's really only available for larger organizations. But these sort of connections beget other connections. So, having, real conversations with artists, and going back to my original point that like everybody in these issues, we're all just people, right? Prolyphic is a rapper, but he's a dude who's concerned about the world his kid's going to grow up in. Right. Joe is a writer, but she, also really cares a lot about how clean her water is that she drinks. And that's, I think a lot of nonprofits forget, in terms of they get kind of starstruck and they forget that like, this really isn't all that different than, talking with your grandmother or your uncle about what it is that you do for a living. So I think if there are two sort of concrete tips for how you start these interactions on a one-to-one basis, it is, one, remember everybody's a real person, right. And two, do your thing. Like you have a compelling reason to reach out to that person. Recognize that your time is valuable as well. So right. I think those would be two top-level deals. Great,
Joe. Comments. We've been talking about the ways in which that have merged with what you're doing, with what the film festival that Ben's working on doing, with the way Prolyphic is connecting with collaborators. What are your thoughts about this in terms of taking it to the next level for leveraging it for activism?
Yeah. I want to touch on one thing that Chris just said at the end, which
Sure.
I think bears repeating, which is time is valuable, and that's true on both sides. I think something that artists and writers and nonprofits all have in common is very limited time and limited resources. Pay writers and artists that you're working with for their time. They are trying to make a living, often a very narrow living, doing their art. or they have day jobs and they're doing writing on the side. So pay them for what they're doing for you. And then build in time. Nonprofit staff are very busy. We have a lot going on, especially if we're engaged in political work. Writers and artists tend also to be very busy and juggling a lot in their lives, personal and professional. So, make sure that if you're going to do a collaboration like this, build in enough of a timeline and build in enough time to really build relationships and build a positive collaboration. Another thing that I would say in looking for writers or artists to collaborate with is look beyond the top tier. Often with nonprofits, we're looking for like the Mark Ruffalo's or the Matt Damons to show up at our rallies and speak, the really big names who are going to draw crowds. But as far as like creating quality content to engage, we're always looking to do audience engagement at nonprofits. We're looking to connect with people, create an emotional connection to the work that we're doing, and looking beyond the top tier to maybe slightly lesser known artists or writers, but folks who still have a platform, who do really amazing work, who may have more time or ability to connect with a nonprofit, and also more to benefit from collaborating with you and the visibility that you can give them to your audience. And say, look beyond the obvious big names and look at who really cares about the work that you're doing and wants to connect in that way.
That's an interesting point because, and I think this is going to speak to Prolyphic's view, who's back up on screen here, and that is, if you're thinking, there's two sides of this. There's engaging the artist, and there's engaging the art and leveraging the art for resistance. And if you're fixated on the big name stars, you're really focused on the artist and the name and less about the product, the piece of art that's the compelling thing. And I think if we look at what influences people in the world, it's been said to me by a few people that art is far more influential than anything advocacy and politics ever presents, because art itself is so powerful. And so when we focus on leveraging the artist as the name, as the A-list star, the star power, we lose sight of the fact that it's not the person that's the influencer, it's the art that they're creating that's the influencer. And that's why I think, looking below the most famous people to people who are creating, who may not be as famous, but are creating really compelling and persuasive and view altering art is really, I think, where we need to be focusing. You had a comment, Prolyphic, about this, and I would love to hear what it is.
Yeah, I wanted to say to Joe and to Chris's point about like reaching out to just to speak on music artists. I would just go ahead and do it because and artists need to put their egos aside sometimes, because a lot of times what happens is if they don't get something out of it, like something quick, like whether it's money or they're going to get this amount of exposure, they'll just pass on it. I mean, they won't even pay no mind to it. So I think it's up to it's an artist's responsibility if they really want to make change and they really want to collaborate to, again, put your ego aside and maybe do something for free, or maybe do something that that kind of gets you out of your comfort zone or gets you into a different genre, a different fan base. And I think it's the other thing I wanted to say was
That's quite all right.
Yeah.
It'll come back to you. So Ben wanted to raise the point that, as much as we're talking about the content, the people, it's also about the reach, the key to be able to reach people. So I think that would suggest that there is an element of, the A-listers do give you that extra reach, but the advocacy organizations can compensate for that. But with the fact that, an organization like Joe, a consultant like Chris, or somebody like me, our jobs are to figure out ways to amplify the artist, to amplify the message, to amplify the campaign in ways that far exceed what might have been the potential without our help. And so the reach is a very important thing. I want to bring I'm going to bring Chris back up because I think he has a comment here, and let's see how this works here. That's not going to work. Chris and Spotlight tinkering with the new interface here that allows us to bring up many more video cams, and we should have Chris here in a moment. There you are.
Yeah. I just had 2 points on this. One, I want to caution against this idea of like reach out for the B team, because it's what you can get. There's a real
that's not what I was
there.
suggesting.
Yeah, but I don't want anyone to take that message away, because what I've found is these are the folks who are somebody like a Kemia Dawson, who folks might know from like the Juno soundtrack, but she's not a household name, but she is somebody who is very earnest and very well read on issues that you might engage her around, whether that's sort of kids' health stuff, or whether that's like environment or civil rights or whatever. These are the folks who are actually taking the time to get the story right. And then I think that the second thing to think about is, and this probably should be obvious. It is that creativity in these engagements is absolutely imperative. I've definitely seen a lot of organizations who do a very typical type, promotion of a celebrity or whatever that they're working with, whether that's a musician or a writer or whatever, send an email blast out under their name or whatever. It reads like pretty much every other email blast that organization sends, except it has an 8x10 glossy of Prolyphic up at the top of that. I think you really have to, or Joe, or any of these other great folks who are really working on this stuff. I think you really do have to take the time, to Joe's point, to figure out what is their specific story. Like, how are they going to tell this story, and why is their voice unique? And then, secondly, to your point, as a consultant, I think organizations and consulting agencies need to be very creative in terms of expanding expanding that reach, right? So looking to channels where, maybe it isn't an email blast. Maybe it is purely social and a promotion around Instagram and Spotify, because that's how you're going to reach the target audience that you have. But I think there's a main point in this. It's that there's nothing really plug and play about this. It is, concerned people connecting with one another and having the courage to do so, and the tenacity to actually execute on campaigns that can make a material difference.
Yeah, and I just want to drill home on that, that clarification. It's not about don't go for the A list, go for the B list because they're easier to get. It's focus on the art itself. What is this artist producing, and how does it carry forth your campaign message? How does it carry forth the message that people want to hear? And in that respect, we're never really looking for B list. We're looking for the best art is that we want to do, right. And we don't let a famous name obscure our discovery of a better piece of art for the purpose. And right. I think that's really a big point. Ben, you had a comment that you wanted to wrap up with?
Well, there's a couple of my guests. I mean, I think you're right, and I think focusing is clearly the answer here. For example, we work with influencers in the entertainment industry, and like often what we'll do is provide them tweets, posts, information that's related to the campaign in question, which they eagerly accept. They want to be part of it, but they're not really here to sort of define it like that, and maybe they shouldn't, especially when you're looking at things that are so rapid fire. Thank you. So yeah, I think you're right, Chris, for sure. But it might even go deeper than that, where you're actually, putting out the information for them so they can actually post it, which I think happens probably more often than
Right. All right. I'm gonna, we got a nice little wrap up comment there from Ben and from Chris. I'm going to bring Prolyphic up for one, and then we'll get a final comment from Joe, and we'll wrap up the show. But Prolyphic, I got you coming up in a moment here, and There you are.
Yeah, so just to speak on like collaborating with nonprofits and artists, if you are going to collaborate and put something out there, make it be strategic, because social media is flooded with agendas and people looking for attention. So if you're going to do it, like plan it, strategize out, like, and get like the big push it deserves, instead of just like throwing these one-time things out there or just trying to keep flooding it, because it's just going to end up lost in the shuffle of the mess that is social media. So if you're going to do it, plan it and put it out and do it right.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. You know, the tools are available to everybody, but using the tools effectively is a big plus. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to let Joe wrap us up here, and then I'll wrap up the whole program. Joe, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Prolyphic just said, and I think it's really all about the quality of the art and focusing on creating a really quality product. Don't water it down. Don't let your entire staff of your organization tear it apart and rewrite it. Like, trust the artist that they're going to produce something that's quality and heartfelt, and let that art speak to your audience. And also, there's a community in all of these genres, in music and science fiction. There's a community that's hungry for this stuff, and people who are, whether they're engaged on the nonprofit side or on the side of the art, they want this stuff. They want to be engaging with these issues. They want to be thinking about it. So everything that we can do on both sides to give that to them and help engage them is going to help.
Yeah, this is a really great thing, and as I said, and thank you very much to Joe and Prolyphic and to Chris and always to Ben for joining us. And let me just say that, you know, the most important thing we have to think about here is that this is about getting messages, getting ideas, getting a sense of, you know, what is going on in the world and what we can do about it into the heads of the people. And art is just an amazingly powerful tool for doing this, a vehicle for doing this. I think it's unfair to call art a tool, but and so, you know, hats off to the artists of the world, the filmmakers, the music producers like Prolyphic, the writers, whether they write science fiction or even nonfiction, whatever they're writing, you know, creating this material, and then the activists and the organizers and the nonprofits that are taking this material and using it to advance social good. This is what it's all about. And this is a way to tap into some of the most powerful content, the most powerful images, the most powerful messages, and really take this idea of creating a social movement, a political movement, a resistance movement, and taking it to the next level. So I want to thank my guests again. This has been really, I think, an important conversation for us to focus on. Next week, we're going to have a guest. Michael Bassetta will be there. My guest. He is a PhD student in politics out in Copenhagen. He's focusing on social media and politics. Sounds kind of familiar. And we had a podcast interview yesterday where I was interviewed on his show. Great conversation. We're going to have him on the show next week to talk about some of the things that are going on in Europe, because Europe is a hotbed of political activity right now, social media activity right now, digital activism going on right now. We've got the elections in France with Marine Le Pen and Macron coming on to the runoff. We've got elections coming up in Germany. We now have elections coming up in Britain, in the UK over the next couple of months, and we have Russians getting involved with fake news, and the same way they did over here. We've got Breitbart setting up offices in France and Germany after having an office in the UK to try to influence things. Everything's coming to a head. The things that we saw happen in the election here there's attempts to recreate it in Europe. Whether or not it'll succeed, we'll see. This weekend, we'll see whether or not Marine Le Pen actually is able to overcome that 20-point deficit she had going into the debate yesterday or not. She's presenting a message that's very similar to Donald Trump. She's getting the same kind of support from Breitbart and apparently from the Russians that Donald Trump got. And Whether it's collusion or not, we'll leave that aside. And so a lot of interesting things happening, and we have a great guest next week to talk about it. So, as always, this has been the Dr. DigiPol Show. You can find us here on Thursday afternoons at 4 p.m., but you can also watch all of our shows live on our Facebook page, or you can watch the archives on demand of past episodes. And our Facebook page is facebook.com/Dr. DigiPol is in. Yes, indeed. Dr. DigiPol is in. So hope to see you there. Like the page. Check out our videos. Like them, share them, comment on them, get the conversation going. And we'll see you next week at 4 o'clock on the Dr. DigiPol Show. And as always, we will end the show with a little bit of head bopping. And here we go. See ya. Bye-bye.